4,725 wire transfers totaling more than $1 billion. That is the staggering number revealed when Senator Ron Wyden stood on the Senate floor and described the contents of a hidden Treasury file tied to Jeffrey Epstein's vast financial dealings. This file is not rumor, not speculation, but an actual set of government documents, locked away in a cabinet where only a handful of people have been allowed to view it. For years the public has been denied access, and for years officials have quietly resisted every attempt to bring it to light. Wyden's call was simple transparency. What he exposed were not theories but hard numbers, numbers that tell a story of massive financial flows, networks of power, and potential complicity that reaches further than most people can imagine.
He and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, say, nope, nothing to investigate. When it comes to Epstein and sex trafficking, all these claims are just ludicrous. I want the American people to know that that's wrong. If you want to know why, just look at the latest report from our investigators that was discussed in the New York Times this morning. Now, somewhere in the Treasury Department, Mr. President, locked away in a cabinet drawer, is a big Epstein file that's full of actionable information. Follow the money details about his financing and operations that await investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking, but I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original.
Consider the scale of those numbers. Nearly $1.1 billion coursing through a single account tied directly to Epstein. This was not scattered spending over decades, it was not a trickle of quiet investments, it was thousands of distinct transfers, each one a potential clue, each one a line of inquiry waiting to be pursued. That kind of volume does not match the behavior of one man indulging his wealth. That is the pattern of a network. It looks like organized laundering, like the financial movements of multinational criminal enterprises. To dismiss that scale is to deliberately ignore the red flags waving right in front of our faces. What makes this even more disturbing is where the money moved. According to Wyden, the Treasury file shows transfers passing through Russian banks, some of which are now under sanction for corruption, secrecy, and ties to hostile networks. Why would Epstein, a man already exposed as a predator, funnel money through those institutions? Why did so many of his victims come from places like Russia, Belarus, and Turkey, countries consistently referenced in the trafficking records? The overlap between the financial trail and the human trail is impossible to ignore. These women and girls were not appearing out of thin air. They were pulled into a system, a pipeline, that was international in scale and financial in design. Yet instead of a wave of investigations, instead of public outrage leading to accountability, the response from the agencies holding these documents was almost mocking. When Wyden formally asked for the full file to be given to Congress, Treasury officials issued a polite but empty letter, claiming he already had what he needed. In Washington speak, this is a tactic well known to anyone who has ever tried to cut through bureaucracy. It was essentially a coded rejection, the government's way of saying stop asking questions, you will not get more. Wyden himself made it clear, this was code for go pound sand. And if a senior senator is told to back off, what chance does the public have to ever see what is inside those files? At the center of this silence is one name that stands out, Pam Bondi. As Florida's Attorney General, she was responsible for a state where Epstein committed many of his most notorious crimes. She had the experience, the context, and the authority to know just how serious this case was. And yet when she had the chance to pursue the truth at the national level, she chose not to. Instead of pushing for transparency, she allowed the silence to continue. Instead of demanding accountability, she stood with those who preferred secrecy. For someone whose role should have been to protect victims and expose predators, her decision to stay quiet represents not just a failure of leadership, but a betrayal of responsibility. This goes far beyond the actions of one official. It is a reflection of a system that bends under the weight of power. Promises of transparency collapse when faced with the risk of exposing the wrong names. Campaign slogans about accountability become meaningless once the spotlight turns toward elites. Bureaucracies, designed to serve the people, become walls shielding those who least deserve protection. And the survivors, the women and girls whose lives were shattered, are left to watch as their pain is ignored and their abuser's network remains hidden. The more you look at the evidence, the clearer it becomes that Epstein may not have been the mastermind so many assumed. He may have been one cog in a machine far larger, one visible face in a network that stretched across borders, banks, and institutions. The scale of money laundering suggested by the Treasury file points to something systemic. If those numbers were fully investigated, they could reveal connections that would shock the world, connections that may include figures too powerful for institutions to comfortably confront. That is the only explanation that makes sense for the stubborn resistance to release the file. It is not withheld because it is irrelevant, but because it is explosive. Meanwhile, survivors are left abandoned. They are told in effect that the people who enabled their abuse are untouchable. They watch as government agencies bury evidence that could validate their stories. And they see that when predators are tied to wealth and influence, justice is not just delayed, it is denied. What message does that send to the rest of society? That accountability only exists for the powerless. That if you are wealthy enough, connected enough, the system itself will bend to protect you. This is not just an injustice, it is a dangerous precedent. Wyden is refusing to accept this outcome. His demand is clear: release the Treasury file in full to Congress. Not summaries carefully curated to hide details. Not redacted pages designed to mislead. The full file, because when you follow the money, you follow the truth, and right now, the truth remains hidden. If this file were released, it would no longer be about speculation. It would be about documented financial evidence, undeniable patterns, and names that could not so easily be erased. That is why there is such resistance. Once the information is public, it cannot be contained again, but there is a risk. If attention fades, if people move on, if outrage dies down, the cover-up will succeed. The file will stay locked away, and those responsible for burying it will win. The powerful will remain untouchable, and the survivors will remain unheard. That is why this moment matters. Because it is not only about what Jeffrey Epstein did, it is about how governments handle predators when predators are tied to elite networks. It is about whether transparency is real, or just a slogan repeated when convenient. It is about whether justice exists equally for everyone, or only for those without power. Ask yourself why a billion-dollar file remains hidden in a Treasury cabinet instead of being pursued by investigators. Ask why a former attorney general from the very state where Epstein operated would choose silence over exposure. Ask why a senator has to beg for access while the agencies tasked with oversight dismiss his requests with bureaucratic brush-offs. These are not coincidences, they are deliberate choices. Choices made to shield the powerful from scrutiny. Choices that reveal how far the system will go to protect itself. When Wyden spoke, he was not only speaking to other lawmakers, he was speaking to the public. He was sending a message that this fight will not be won inside one chamber in Washington. It will be won if enough people refuse to let this story die, if there is consistent pressure, if silence is no longer tolerated. Because files can be unsealed, investigations can be opened, and truth can be forced into daylight, but only if there is enough demand to overcome the resistance of those who prefer the shadows. 4,725 transfers. $1.1 billion. Banks with histories of corruption. Victims trafficked across borders. Agencies stonewalling investigations. An attorney general staying silent when she should have acted. That is what is already documented. That is not rumor, not speculation, but verified data. And yet it sits, buried, waiting, while officials pretend there is nothing more to see. This fight is not over. The file exists, the numbers exist, the truth exists. The question is whether the public will demand to see it, or whether silence will bury it forever. Justice for survivors, accountability for enablers, and faith in the system itself depend on the answer. When you follow the money, you follow the truth, and the truth is still locked inside the Treasury cabinet. The real question is how much longer we will allow it to stay there.